Flies in the Vaseline we are. Sometimes it blows my mind. And welcome everybody to Gen X Wasteland. I always got to put that Stone Temple Pilots quote. And you see part of the quote too from the same song. What is real and what's for sale? So, but this is what we deal with here on Gen X Wasteland. My name is Miguel Connor, and I'm so happy to see you. A little break from the podcast, although last week I did put up my conversation with Saul Luckman on Elvis Presley, the blues, and the crossroads. So you can get it, of course, at all podcast providers and on my YouTube channel. So good to see everybody again. I hope everybody's having a good August, the dog days of summer. And we got an exciting show. I am so excited about this, as the topics are certainly in my David Bowie book, which I have completed the first draft. And now I am pitching to the publishers. And without a doubt, one of the biggest influences on the Starman is also our topic today, and that is William Burroughs. And we will certainly unpack this. With us to talk about this is Tommy Cowan, and he will be discussing, well, his work on Burroughs is just incredible. I would certainly check out his paper, The Archontic Spirituality of William S. Burroughs. Tommy, thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Honors all ours. And with us, it's always an honor to be joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Sherilyn Jones. Sherilyn, how are you doing today?
Doing well. We cooled off a little bit in Montana, so we're not in an oven for a few days, so that's good. I really look forward to hearing all of this intel on Burroughs and learning quite a bit from you, Tommy. So looking forward to it.
Indeed, yes. And yes, it's finally, we've had a break too from the horrible heat here in northern Illinois. So we shall see what the gods have in store for us. But let's start with you, Tommy, or your origin story. How did you become interested in William Burroughs?
Well, I first became interested in Burroughs because of the David Cronenberg film. And believe that's 1991 or somewhere around there. It's a great movie, and I thought it was incredibly interesting, and Peter Weller's great. Ian Holmes in it. I mean, just a fantastic cast and fantastic real effects, and just very strange and challenging film. And I like challenging things sometimes. And so then when I was doing my undergrad, I was studying anthropology in Sacramento. I started reading Burroughs just as a fan. I read Naked Lunch and Cities of the Red Night. Those would be the first two things that I plugged through. Some Place the Dead Roads, getting into that Western Lands trilogy, which is a bit more accessible than the 1960s stuff. And then I had gone on to teach English for a little bit and then decided to go back to grad school. And I ended up at the University of Amsterdam studying Western esotericism because I had always been interested in esoteric religion. I had some very unusual experiences when I was about 19 or 20 years old, which sort of changed my worldview. I experimented with ayahuasca at the time when I was 19. And also experienced some paranormal events, some multi-witness kind of paranormal events as well, which sort of changed my perspective on the universe. And so I became very interested in esoteric scholarship. That's how I ended up at Amsterdam studying with Van Graaf, who's this, very important guy.
Yeah.
And I read an article that Hanegraaff had written about the history of the 2012 phenomenon that had predicted a apocalyptic event that would result in the evolution of human consciousness on the planet sometime around the year 2012 when the Mayan calendar comes to an end. And I had written papers about Burroughs and Geisen for other courses when I was doing my master's there. And so I was learning a lot more, and I realized that this article that Hanegraaff had published, and I believe probably had first been published around 2009. It actually is mistaken. So it attributes the 2012 phenomenon solely to the McKennas, essentially.
Right.
But this is around 2018 when I'm doing my master's, so a lot of other scholarship had happened, and it had looked at there were multiple authors in 1975 that had talked about this idea or about ideas that were roughly similar. Uh, those being Frank Waters and Jose Arguelles as well. So something happens in 1975 where there's an explosion of this idea, and multiple people begin talking about it. And I had read one of the early cut-up manifestos that Burroughs and Geisen put out in 1960 called The Exterminator, which is a little bit different from his 1973 Exterminator. Well, it's completely different. It's not the same at all, I should say. And I noticed that there is the same concept exists in this book in 1960, way before 1975. And I started trying to trace out a lineage, a transmission of this idea from Burroughs to this 75 explosion, and it's pretty doable. Both of the McKennas cite and discuss Burroughs occasionally, and Jose Arguelles was actually teaching at Naropa University in Boulder in 1975 at the same time Burroughs was teaching there. And Arguelles also cites Burroughs and Ginsberg in his work from 1975 as well. So, I mean, I saw it as an opportunity to step in and fill this gap in the historical scholarship, and wrote an article about it. And one of the things that I try to do is I try to bring a different perspective to how we look at esoteric religion in literature, but also
Mhm.
look at literature as a form of esoteric religion. And one of my arguments is that one of the reasons why we haven't noticed, or prior to this article that I wrote, not many people had noticed that Burroughs is actually one of the central figures of this 2012 idea,
Mhm.
is that there's this disciplinary struggle for Burroughs, and literary critics have dominated the academic discourses about Burroughs. And there was some work from religious studies on Burroughs, notably with Christopher Partridge and the biographers of Burroughs as well, and some other people, but it was limited. And if you look at particular literary critics that work with Burroughs, they actually discourage analyzing his literature as a form of esoteric practice because they think it's degrading to literature. So there's this
Yeah.
anti-magical, anti-esoteric polemic that exists in literary criticism, and I believe that this is preventing us from learning more about Burroughs and just how big of an impact he had. And I think if you really start keeping track of these things and you start tallying all of these movements that he had a huge influence on, he's arguably
Yeah.
one of, if not the most influential esotericist of the second half of the 20th century. I mean, not just because of the 2012 phenomenon, which was huge, but also because of the 23 Enigma, which he started. He was a huge influence on chaos magic, a huge influence on Discordianism. I mean, and it goes on from there, and cut up and all those types of things, and Topi and the Temple of Psychic Youth, I should say.
He was huge. I mean, even in your paper, you write who he influenced, and we've got the Rolling Stones, of course, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Patti Smith, Frank Zappa, Genesis Peorage, Kurt Cobain, Steely Dan, and all these figures. I mean, he does Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He was a huge influence on the great comic book writers like Grant Morrison and others. I mean, it's just his impact is just massive, isn't it, Tommy? And I would say overlooked, very overlooked.
It is. It's very overlooked. And since that article came out, there was a book that was written by Casey Ray that talks exclusively about Burroughs' influence on music, which is very good. I believe it's called Burroughs and the Cult of Rock and Roll. Uh, but I also think one of the problems that we have with tracing Burroughs' impact is that people who are influenced by Burroughs are sometimes scared or apprehensive to admit how much of an influence he had on them. Part of it's because of how controversial he is as a writer and as a thinker. I mean, the books are very offensive, they're misogynist, they're violent, they're
Yeah.
pedophilic in a lot of ways, but they're also very, very interesting. And he was very talented. So people have this love hate relationship with him that makes them afraid to talk about Burroughs. But also, I think that esoteric religion is a factor in this too. People are sometimes a little afraid to admit how serious they take his theological ideas. And I think we see that a bit in David Bowie too. And we could get into that if you want.
Yeah, and that's normal. I mean, God, with Philip K. Dick scholars, God forbid you bring up his Gnosticism or mysticism. They don't want to hear about his visions and all that. I have the same pushback that people have with Burroughs, and and the exception would be David Bowie, because he had no problem shilling for Burroughs. Burroughs interviewed him for Rolling Stone, and they had a great time. And uh, Bowie talked about his huge influence. He didn't. You see his influence. Obviously, we can get more into it in Diamond Dogs and a lot of his other albums, and of course, the cut-up technique was essential for Bowie's songwriting and so forth. And I know, what did Bowie, the thing too is, I guess maybe he got this from Burroughs, but this idea of shit posting or joking, you never know it was true, or was he delusional, or is he myth making? Because Bowie called Burroughs' cut up techniques a Western form of Tarot. And I'm like, well, that sounds great to the public, but isn't all Tarot Western? But that's Bowie sort of just trying to put some flair into things. But yeah, Bowie was very much an overt fan of Burroughs, and you see Burroughs' theology just all over Diamond Dogs and Scary Monsters and a lot of his albums, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's controversial to actually track, I think, exactly where the Burroughs influence starts. It's admitted, it's explicit in Diamond Dogs, and from Diamond Dogs, it continues to be used in multiple albums. It's used in this cut up technique and Burroughs influence. It's used in the Berlin trilogy. It's
Mm-hmm.
also
Yeah,
used
because the
in
Brian
the album he
Eno,
did.
Brian Eno was into that. Yeah,
Yes, and they had those artist cards that were supposedly like another form of tarot for
right.
solving particular artistic problems that you would shuffle and draw randomly from. They saw that as articulating with cut up. But also in the album Outside in the 90s, he
Just thinking of that.
keeps using cut up. He continues to be interested in it. When I was looking at some of these interviews, it's very interesting because when you read this Rolling Stone interview, which takes place at the end of 1973, and then it's published early 1974, they present it as though Burroughs had never really heard of, or excuse me, Bowie had never really heard of Burroughs and had not read any of the works. And so the interviewer buys Bowie all of these Burroughs books. Bowie is doing a lot of cocaine at the time, so it's hard for him to read. He's only able to read one book he claims, which is Nova
Of
Express, and he
Express.
loves it. Um, but then the other books he doesn't get to, but he promises to read more of Burroughs later. And so this is supposedly Bowie's first true exposure to Burroughs is 1973. And so this is kind of after the Ziggy Stardust character had been well established and had a couple of albums behind it.
Mm.
But then in other interviews, in multiple interviews later in the 90s, he backdates the Burroughs influence, and he says that I was into Burroughs when I was a teenager, and actually when in 1970, when I was conceiving the idea for Ziggy Stardust, I was thinking about the Wild Boys, this Burroughs book. And also, he had an older brother named Terry that was very interested in esoteric literature. He said Terry had given him Burroughs to read when he was like a
Exactly.
kid. And this discrepancy is noticed by some other writers or biographers, but they've always taken the opinion that no, what happens in the Rolling Stone interview is what is true. And so Bowie saying this conflicting information in the 90s, that's him misremembering what actually happened. He's confused. He was doing cocaine at the time, therefore he doesn't actually know about his past. He's messing it up. I would like to question that interpretation of the events because I think it's equally as likely to me that this interview is very staged and artificial. And
Right.
I mean, Bowie might kind of be full of shit to a certain extent in the interview. He probably had read some Burroughs, I think, but was playing down the influence for whatever type of media public relations strategy that he was engaging in with this Rolling Stone exposure. And there's something else, I think, from the interview which leads me to believe that he was doing this. And Burroughs had read a bunch of Bowie lyrics in preparation for the interview. And one of the things he had read was 8-line poem, which is on the Hunky Dory album. And Burroughs says, that really reminds me of T.S. Eliot. And Bowie just goes, oh, I've never read him. And Burroughs laughs in a response to this. He just laughs. And the interpretation of pretty much every writer that I've seen after this interview is that Burroughs is laughing at Bowie for being not well read. Right? He thinks it's ridiculous that he didn't read T.S. Eliot, but I would challenge that interpretation as well. I think Burroughs is probably laughing because he knows that Bowie is lying about it. Because there have been other writers that have noticed possible T.S. Eliot references on the Ziggy Stardust album. So I mean, I think Bowie's playing mind games when he says like, "Oh, I don't know who that is. I haven't read that," or whatever. I mean, there's conflicting information too about how he actually discovered Burroughs too. He had an ex-girlfriend at the time in the early 70s who said that she told him about Burroughs and that he said, "Oh, he didn't even know who Burroughs was when she told him about it," and she was the one who bought him Naked Lunch. And this is all before the Rolling Stone interview, but people, for whatever reason, that got ignored, or they didn't believe her. They thought she was confused. But I mean, it's well known that Bowie was a huge fan of Kerouac,
Big
and
one. Big
On the
time.
Road had a big influence on his life. Burroughs is a character in
Right.
On the Road. It seems very unlikely that he wouldn't know even who that is. I think he's playing this character of someone who doesn't read that much, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. And I think I would agree with you. I think when Terry turned him on to the beats, I think Burroughs was part of it. Yes, Bowie, like Philip K. Dick, is the most unreliable witness. You have to double check, and there's so many contradictions because, of course, both of them probably had schizophrenia. Both of them had and they loved myth making, like you said. But I think Burroughs, and you see Burroughs' influence in The Man Who Sold the World, Parts of Hunger. You see it already there. But regardless, Burroughs would be laughing. It's like, hey, time is your enemy. Time doesn't move linear. And even in Aladdin Sane, his song Time, that could have been written by Burroughs because he basically associates time with the demiurge, this evil creature that's just raping and destroying humanity. So, yeah, it's like, yeah, take your pick. There's many realities with both Burroughs and Bowie, isn't there, Tommy? It's
But
fun.
Yeah, Burroughs would do very similar stuff in interviews. He would say, "Oh, I haven't read that," or "That person didn't influence me that much." But he's doing the same thing. People love to downplay particular influences for various reasons, whether they think it makes them look more original and creative, or it distances them from particular kinds of politics. There's many reasons why people do it.
Yeah, good point. Good point. But yeah, Bowie was a master with the media, so he knew how to play the game better than probably anybody. Yeah, I want to get into Burroughs's unique Gnosticism, which again would influence Bowie, and of course, like you said, he was ahead of the game in so many of the esoteric fashions or ideas that we today accept. He was ahead of the curve in so much. But Sherilyn, let me bring you in. Do you have a what do you think, or do you have a question at this point in time, in this linear time, if it's linear?
Yeah, I do. I have a question somewhere on this circle of time. And comments. It's what you're saying is reminding me so much of Jung's journey as well. You know, where you have to, he continually throughout his career, he would obfuscate his relationship to Gnosticism and alchemy and the metaphysical and his own journeys, into madness and just say, no, 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 that was something else. But the people closest to him knew this, but the general public would never know it unless you had actually read the Jaffe Protocols, the original, what he actually said, not what made it into the English version of his autobiography, but what he actually said, and so much was left on the cutting room floor. And I think it kind of goes back to this idea of, we take it for granted now that we can just talk about this stuff and not get thrown in a psychiatric hospital. Although there are always things that are going to get you put into those places, right? We imagine we live in a free world, or free society, but there's still a lot you can't say. But back then it was even more so, with these sort of outre religious topics. And you couldn't just, you could, but you were never going to get that kind of audience or awareness if you just came out and exposed every single thing you thought and the truth. But then if you look back through time, and I've just been going through Peter Kingsley's book on Jung, Catafalque, where he goes into all these different archives and shows, Jung was completely Gnostic, metaphysical, struggled with the reality game all the time. And taking it back to even the earlier, the earliest pre-Socratic philosophers, where you don't just go out and say what exactly the truth is. You would never do that. That would be the mark of a very unwise person, because the masses behave like brutes, and they always will. It's not just because some religions came along and made people more orthodox or more brainwashed. They've always behaved like this. So there's always an exoteric and an esoteric. And when you start hitting that line and getting different stories, and if you were that person, if you were Bowie or Burroughs or Jung, you're going to have to make decisions in those moments of like, where's the moment where you tell the noble lie, because if you don't, you will no longer have a way to get through to those few people that can actually hear you. So that's what it was kind of bringing up to me. And also all of these people have this disciplinary firewall. I don't know if they use those exact words, but Burroughs, you could look at with religious studies and with all these different angles, seriously, with his scholarship, and with Jung, you could look at alchemy or the classics or all these. You could seriously look at his work just through that lens, but there's this disciplinary firewall, or no, you just have to look at it just through lit crit, and if you don't use these words, you won't get on the journal, and you're definitely not going to get tenure. So, I went on a little bit, but there was stuff there too with Jung seeing this 2020 around the 2012 date, which is really interesting because one of the last dreams that was ever reported he had was about the end of humanity, which he predicted in 50 years, which would have been 2011. And it was very little reported, but it's documented that this was the last dream he ever had, and he was very serious about it. So yeah, I look more to hearing more what you have to say, Tommy. I'd love to hear more about the relationship with Burroughs and Kurt Cobain, because I want to get this question out there before I forget. I worked in music for a few years, and pre-internet days, there's a lot of things I remember reading that have never made it onto this screen format. And I wish I would have saved the magazines, but one of them was a picture of Kurt Cobain and Burroughs' orgone box, and a report that he got clean after that. And it was shortly after that he committed suicide. So I don't know if you ever looked into that, but it's really fascinating. So thanks for bringing this forward. But that idea of this noble lie, and I would always expect that these deep thinkers, Stick, Burroughs, Bowie, Jung, would never tell all that they knew to the general public.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I think even Burroughs and Geisen are also participating in these types of media strategies to give artistic merit to these esoteric practices rather than portraying them as explicitly esoteric practices, which sometimes they did as well. But there's this drive to position it within artistic tradition so that it's meritorious in its own formal right. And I think there's controversy in terms of the origin of cut up and exactly when he starts doing it, when Burroughs and Geisen begin doing it, and how they became inspired to do it. The official story is that Burroughs is being interviewed, and he meets the interviewer elsewhere outside the Beat Hotel, and then which is where Burroughs was living at the time, and Geisen was living at this Beat Hotel in Paris as well. And they walk back to the hotel, and he walks the interviewer into Geisen's room, where Geisen supposedly is in the act of discovering cut up as they walk in. And then this is like the big eureka moment for Burroughs, and he says, this is it, this is what I've been looking for. But again, it I think it's very similar to the Bowie Burroughs interview in that it seems very fortuitous that Cut Up is discovered in the middle of this big magazine article that's being written about them. It seems artificial and contrived to me. And there's some conflicts as well, because almost all Burroughs scholars will say that Naked Lunch doesn't have any cut up in it, that cut up happens later. It happens in 1960 after Naked Lunch comes out in 1959. But in Burroughs' 1985 introduction to Queer, he actually says that there is some cut up in Naked Lunch, and it's in the 59 edition as well. So there's this conflict there, and we don't necessarily know exactly what's going on. He's older in 1985, and he was doing a lot of drugs. Maybe he's misremembering it, but it's a very significant cut up. Or I shouldn't call it cut up as if I know it is, but I mean Burroughs says it is. It's a very significant passage which refers to the death of his wife, and it's this incredibly emotional addition that he makes to the book. And so it would be very unusual for him to misremember something like this. And so my argument is that the origin story of Cut Up is something that they cooked for this magazine article, and they did it in an attempt to portray it as something which was purely in a formalistic Dada tradition, and it didn't have these other esoteric dimensions behind it. Not initially, the esoteric dimensions supposedly came later. But I think it's much more likely that he's thinking about this concept well before this magazine article, and that this passage and perhaps many passages in Naked Lunch are actually cut up and we just don't know it. Because of particular experiences that he has in the 1950s leading up to when Naked Lunch gets made, one of these is getting treated for opiate addiction by Dr. John Dent. Dr. John Dent had linguistic exercises and psychoanalytical methods based on language-free association that were supposed to have therapeutic benefits. But also his experiences with ayahuasca in the early 1950s, the way he talks about them is very powerful. And this whole interzone city, which is part of the Burroughs mythos that starts in Naked Lunch, it's a reference to an experience that he has in ayahuasca during an ayahuasca journey, and it is literally a cut up city. So it seems like he's thinking about this concept because of lots of esoteric experiences that he has way before he ever amasses the word hoard. But I don't think he wants anyone to know that ayahuasca is this driving force behind the origin of cut up. And it's very interesting to me as well that Michael Taussig writes a great book about ayahuasca in the 90s called uh, Shamanism, Colonialism, the Wild Man, where he his theoretical contribution on ayahuasca consciousness is something he calls montage, and it's basically a description of cut up processes. It's very influenced by Burroughs. And so, yeah, I mean, even even Burroughs and Geisen are very much participating in this disciplinary hedging that's going on for a variety of reasons. My argument is that I don't think it helps. The argument, and maybe this is a problem that Jung has, is that he's too esoteric for psychology courses proper now in the university. The argument has traditionally been that if we analyze Burroughs as a form of esoteric religion, it detracts from the literary quality of the work.
Mhm.
And if we emphasize the literary quality of the work, that's what gives him the biggest audience. But I think that his influence on esoteric spirituality, regardless, is perhaps bigger than his influence on literary form is. So I don't think the argument makes any sense. And we could maybe make a similar argument for Jung. Not that Jung didn't have a huge influence on psychoanalytic methods as well, but he also had a big influence on spirituality. So I don't see this argument that, at least if we're talking about influence, just in terms of influence, I don't think there's no good reason to separate these two things and say that one detracts from the other. Um, the Kurt Cobain thing is a very interesting thing, and I could touch on that just a little bit. I don't know too much about it. I know that Cobain adored Burroughs' books, thought he was brilliant. I believe that Cobain perhaps gets into Burroughs because of Bowie, because he's originally a Bowie fan, and this is how he kind of discovers beat literature. And then, yes, at one point, Burroughs is living out in Lawrence, Kansas, in his later years, and Cobain journeys out to see the master. And Burroughs still had an operating orgone accumulator at the time, which is a device designed by Wilhelm Reich to assist orgone accumulation. It's this box with wood on the outside, metal on the inside. You sit in there and you accumulate your orgone energy, which is kind of very similar to Vril, other
Mm.
19th century kind of concepts of energy, magnetism, things like that. And that they did an album together. They didn't actually record together in the same room, but they did The Priest, they called him, which is Burroughs reading some of his writing, and Cobain is doing a Jimi Hendrix like distortion guitars, experimental kind of jazz, somewhere between jazz, metal, and just noise. Very interesting, spooky album. Lots of Burroughs albums are very spooky. I know that Burroughs, I believe that's the only time they met. And I know that Burroughs was very concerned about Cobain. He said
Mm.
that Cobain did not look happy or well, and that was his primary impression of Kurt.
Wow. Fascinating. And why don't we unpack a little bit of Burroughs's Gnosticism? I think you're spot on in describing him, archonticism, which is different. It is different. I might have a little counter argument, but tell us about Burroughs's brand of Gnosticism, which is, I would say, very Gnostic. There's no.
It's hard to trace when it begins. He's a student of esoteric religion from a young age. He's interested in folklore and traditional Irish spells and things like that, witchcraft. He studies witchcraft, he studies Tibetan Buddhism, yoga, things like this. He's a fan of W.B. Yeats and a lot of other esoteric literary authors. He accidentally kills his wife, Joan Vollmer, in 1951. Very famous event. They are playing a William Tell game in an apartment. She puts a glass on her head. He attempts to shoot the glass off with a pistol. He accidentally misses the glass entirely and kills her.
Mhm.
This sends his life in a completely different direction. Obviously, it's a very big deal. And part of his process coping with what he did was to believe that there's some supernatural explanation for it. It's not the first paranormal experience he had. He's had hallucinations when he was a child, and many synchronicities and things like that. And I think even in the book Junkie, which was written before Joan died, there's esoteric stuff in Junkie as well. He had not done ayahuasca yet, but he was interested in ayahuasca. It comes up at the end of the book. Even the opening page of Junkie is about his esoteric worldview and about how there are ghosts and spirits and bad things that exist in this invisible world. So it's there, but it's not really articulated into a complex theology in Junkie. There's just this vibe in Junkie. I think Naked Lunch is where we first see that he is explicitly a theological thinker. And my argument for this is if you look at the opening of Naked Lunch, the very first sentence of Naked Lunch refers to magic. There's a reference to a voodoo doll, and there's also references to ayahuasca, just right at the opening of Naked Lunch. It's setting up this magical vibe. At the end of the first chapter of Naked Lunch, it says that they go west, and this is the ancient Egyptian religion, west is the land of death.
Right.
And obviously in his later works, such as The Wild Boys, A Book of the Dead, and The Western Lands, which is considered his last great novel, the Egyptomania, I should say, is very explicit and open. But I think it's there in Naked Lunch too. It's just more veiled. He wasn't super open with it yet. But so Naked Lunch is it's not a linear narrative. It's a series of shorts, and my argument is that the opening chapter sets up all of the shorts as happening in the invisible world, in the world beyond death. And because the book takes place in a world beyond death, he's already thinking about this Book of the Dead genre, which he makes explicit in The Wild Boys as well. That and he was very explicit later on too in the 1980s through particular essays he wrote, such as The Fall of Art, that writing is a form of magic. It's a magical ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's doing in most of his great works from Naked Lunch onward is he is doing his writing practice is a type of spiritual training in which he is attempting to project his soul out of this cycle of reincarnation, which is the bad world of matter. He believes he was caught in this bad cycle of reincarnation, and he's trying through his creative writing process trying to project his soul into the world of immortality. And there are evil beings who do not want that to happen. They are blocking his path into the land of immortality because it is good for the evil being to keep him in the cycle of reincarnation. I've described these beings as archons, which is a word from Gnosticism, as I'm sure you well know. The archon is often considered a facet of the demiurge. They're associated with planets and also associated with particular parts of the body. So they have these weird, grotesque starting and stopping points that are hard to determine. They're processes of nature, but they're also disembodied at the same time. They're sort of difficult to conceive of. But the archon's job is to actively block the path
Right.
of the human being, the human spirit, back to the pleroma, back to the divine world. And that it's very present in Burroughs. He believed that it was demiurgic forces which puts all humans in this world of matter in the cycle of reincarnation. And that as well, they were associated with bodily functions. They were associated with things like drug addiction, sex addiction. They're associated with love, pain, pleasure. They're associated with language, which is one of the most famous concepts he had, that language is a virus from outer space, which is also kind of mind-bending because it's suggesting that information is a life form, which is something that Philip K. Dick talks about a little bit. And that it's very hard to think of because information is ostensibly a relationship between two different things, or its ratios, or its particular ways in which other things get formed, but yet somehow it's this ratio or this relationship between things. This dynamic is a living being of its own, but it has no material form. It materializes through us in our spoken language. And so when he develops cut-up writing with Geisen around probably 1959, I would say, his argument is that, uh, like much other Gnostic mythologies, chaos is the birth of existence. It's really the first thing. And that when language emerges, it imposes particular types of order on human consciousness. And order is bad in Burroughs. He most often calls it control.
Right.
But order is bad. So, like, oneness is chaos and formlessness. What he calls two-ness is order and consciousness, bodily consciousness and ego and time, and that is all bad. That is all wicked. And so by taking something like language, which has this incredibly linear structure, it's the linearity of human language is part of how human beings get embedded in time. And so what cut-up writing could do by cutting up particular passages and rearranging the sections of them, it was a way for him to sort of scramble time. And this idea of scrambling time that is so important to cut-up writing, it gets expanded into a lot of other esoteric artistic practices. So it gets expanded into something called playback, where he would record sounds in a cafe, for example, and then he would go back the next day and he would play the tape from the previous day aloud in the cafe. And so by mixing time signatures or by having these juxtapositions of streams of time, it somehow creates portals for chaotic energy to enter and cause
Mhm.
particular events to happen. So, for example, he was doing a playback ritual in a cafe once in Boulder, Colorado, and a fight broke out between the waiter and the manager. He claimed that playback is responsible for that. It also gets into theories he had about film and editing, and also media theory, where the modern world has so many more streams of information that are happening simultaneously that product thinking was going to be much easier to do uh, going forward into the future. And it got into ideas that he had for watching multiple TVs at once, which is something that has an influence. And the multi TV sort of incarnation of kind of, we see that in The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is a film
Of
starring
course.
David Bowie, directed by Nicholas Roeg. And Roeg and Burroughs knew each other a little bit. Roeg was very
Oh,
influenced
wow.
by Burroughs.
Fascinating. Yeah. The watching the TV, of course, Pink and the movie The Wall also harkens to Elvis and all the great fallen man trapped in the world of language and images and all that. But also, what I thought was very astute is how you talk about if there's he's definitely got a Gnostic cosmology couched in a modern way. He doesn't like insects, and to him, insects are the evil centipedes, all that, and they're in cahoots with the Mayans. It's just great mythology, like something Philip K. Dick would come up with. But he separates from the classical Gnostics, except for, as you write, Zosimus of Panopolis, Hassan Sabbah of the Assassins later on, some of the Sethians, in that there is no savior coming to get us. There is no woo-woo transcendental gnosis where we are one. This is a violent thing, right, Tommy? Our existence is fistfights, literal fistfights with the archons through our cycles. It's a war out there. And you do see it in some, like the Gospel of Judas, but it's a minority in classical Gnosticism. This let's meet at the hey, okay, corral and let's shoot them. Let's shoot each other up.
Yeah, I think that in some Gnostic mythologies in antiquity, the position of chaos and exactly where it comes into the ontological chain and how good or bad it is, it can kind of vary from text to text or group to
Yeah.
group. Oftentimes, chaos was considered necessary but bad, and because chaos is sometimes not the first thing that exists, and it births the demiurge. For Burroughs, he believed that anything which you could call a god had to be a product of order and was therefore bad.
Mm.
And so your process of deifying yourself, which is what he's trying to do with this Book of the Dead genre, to project the soul into the immortal world, is projecting the soul into chaos, pure. So sort of uh, turning the soul and the spirit into an embodiment of chaos itself. And in if we could call that like the nous, it's very different from most Gnostic definitions of what the nous is. For Burroughs, the nous is pure chaos, and it's this ability to abandon identity. He thought identity was bad because it fixed you in time. It's a product of two-ness, and that true oneness is chaos, and there can't be a fixed identity and chaos, which is good. And so when you read a lot of his stuff, especially in something like The Wild Boys, the achievement of his afterlife paradise is him flowing into all of these different places and bodies and being lost and becoming all of these different people and different alien creatures. And this is his form of ultimate freedom and ultimate pleasure, this ability to project the soul into chaos and embody chaos in as pure of a way as he could.
Yeah, and I know I would say that even the classical Gnostic texts have a lot of violence and fighting, except a lot of them couch it with sexual assault and violence. I mean, even the prettiest Gnostic texts have a lot of rapey stuff. I think that's the violence they are conveying, the tension. That's what the archons do to you. They may not beat you up, but they they will bugger you. You know, that's one of the forces of the demiurge. So in that way, I do see it as violent, if you would. But yeah, he certainly gets it. Sherilyn, what do you think? What do you think so far? Or do you have a question for Tommy?
Well, I just keep seeing all these correlations between people who are willing to take this similar path into what lies behind, this order. And that, similarly, Jung, when he first read his visions of Zosimos, it just crushed him, and he actually read those before he had his experience with the Red
Really?
Book.
Hmm.
And something called to mind I think it was an interview I heard recently with Andrew Gallimore, the DMT guy, and he was talking about Burroughs doing ayahuasca after this experience with his wife, and he was just saying, let's just pause and think about how incredible this was. This guy in the 50s, was it early 60s or the 50s that this
50.
happened with his
50s.
wife? And he just wandered in a suit, this nerdy looking book writer who just killed his wife, just kind of wanders and says, I want to do this ayahuasca. I mean, people didn't do that, so how do you come back to the United States and tell people about, I mean, it's so far outside of our ability to understand, what that would be like. And similarly, Jung with the Red Book, respectable upper middle class doctors didn't have 4-year periods of psychosis where they talked to spirits. It just didn't. How do you convey that? How do you make, but but they both were convinced that there were these really important elements of truth that they needed to convey out of that experience. Where do you even start doing that? And so it just, to me, there was that similarity of experience, and also this idea of bringing forth something different in the language, and language as a virus. And just the other day I was thinking about that language as a virus idea. Where did oh yeah, it's Burroughs, thank you. But McKenna relating that these machine elves would just constantly be jumping up and down and saying, you've got to do something with the language, you have to change the language, you've got to bring out the truth, that if there was some way to open the language up, that's where the freedom would be, and And then finally, this idea of chaos and being spread through things rather than being in the order of oneness, or of, separation, the order of separation. That makes sense. That Jung would say that that's why he would go to Bollingen, is because he felt like he could be spread throughout the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in that stone. I'm in this tree. I don't have to pretend to be locked in the meat suit, So it is really breathtaking to me to see all of these people, these experiences so parallel, and so you can, for me, that speaks of truth when you see all of these parallels between these visionary thinkers who, they couldn't just come out and say exactly what their experience was. They knew you had to transform the language. If you asked them, they were going to deny it, and that they all had this understanding of how we're locked into these cases. So you got to play this game, but ultimately, if you don't transcend it, and Burroughs' idea about the chaos and the constant fighting. Again, I was thinking of Jung at the end of his life, where, you see this staid person who's written all these books and has this respectability. But at the end of his life, he was really devastated by this idea that he said, I never expected the darkness to be so dark.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of his ultimate analyses of this reality was that the darkness was darker than he ever expected it to be, and we don't want to hear that out of our, but make me feel, give me something to solve. Isn't my dream going to help me? So, and if you're not willing to ultimately face that, I think it's always going to be kind of a path for the few.
Well said. Yes. Yeah. Jung he certainly had to walk on eggshells most of his life. It's the same with Jesus, right? I give the masses the parables and you guys get the mysteries. And even then they're going to crucify you, as John Lennon sang in that song, The Ballad of Yoko and John. So it's certainly always been the way. And we have to face the darkness. I know Jung, Sherilyn, when he had his near-death experience, when he went in for a dentist and he died, and he said, oh man, he did also say, this world sucks. What I experienced out of my body up there in the heavens was 1,000 times better than I could have imagined, and basically said, I don't mind going there now. This place is hard. This is a hard world.
As so many, NDE experiencers say, they don't send me back there, please. Please don't.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, Philip K. Dick was talking about, the plasmate. That was the living information, right, Tommy? And it came out of the Nag Hammadi library, and it's infecting the right people. So, do you know if they ever met? Did Dick and Burroughs ever meet or know of each other? I'm drawing a blank.
I don't think they ever met, but Dick talks about Burroughs briefly sometimes.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure Burroughs read some Dick. I don't think he talks about Dick though.
Yeah, I know Dick and Robert Anton Wilson met at a party, and they had a good, 5-minute conversation, but that's basically all they ever knew or wrote about each other. So interesting about these circles.
Did Burroughs died in 1996? Is that right?
97, I believe.
97 was Burroughs. Did Bukowski die that year too? Willem de Kooning, Princess Diana. There was this list.
Really?
It was a huge number of famous people and artists that died that year. It was really interesting. I remember that.
Ginsberg as well. Yeah, him and Burroughs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was just one after the other. So before he died, where was he living when he died? And to your knowledge, did he hold court, really? Did he have a circle of friends to which he sort of passed on his wisdom? Do you know? Or where are his archives? These are several questions. Where does he have archives? Where can we go read his letters? Because that's what I'm learning. If you don't get it straight from the master's mouth, and I wanted to just say real quickly too, when you're talking about people writing biographies or commenting about what he did, this is the same thing I've been reading about Jung, is that everybody's saying what he really meant when he said something. And it's like, wait a minute, can't we just let him speak for himself? Why are you going back and saying, but this is what he really meant, So.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Yeah, he was living in Lawrence, Kansas when he passed. His longtime close friend and secretary, a man who is now the executor of the literary estate. His name's James Grauerholtz. Grauerholtz is from Lawrence, Kansas, and so Burroughs moved there, I believe in the early 80s to be close to James there. And Lawrence, Kansas is a university town, so it has small counterculture, hip vibe to it, which was agreeable for Burroughs as this aging counterculture icon. And yeah, he had many close friends at the time. A lot of them were much younger than he was, but I think it was, he still I think he didn't have much of a sex drive when he was older, but I mean, still had a great appreciation for the young male form. And I think it was very nice for him to be around young guys for many years. He was living in a house that was a bit removed from condensed suburbia or any of the urban parts of Lawrence. He had some property so he could shoot guns, and he had a lot of cats and did painting and gardening, and I think it is maybe the most satisfying time of his life in a lot of ways, I think. And
And is
did all of
University of Kansas, does he have archives there or?
he has many archives. There is an archive here in Tallahassee at Florida State University. There's an archive at the New York Public Library. Ohio State has an archive. I believe the Smithsonian has some things. I think there are things in London, possibly. There's a lot of stuff that if you have the time to travel around, you can go look at things. I've had a really interesting time in the archives here at Florida State University. That's one of the reasons why I chose to do my PhD here, was because of this Burroughs archive. And it's a lot of cut up things that he did in the 70s. And so it was very interesting for me to see exactly what his processes were like at that time, and all of the stuff that would lead up to the great work he would do in the Red Knight trilogy later in the 80s.
Thank you.
And it should be noted too that Burroughs, of course, as we talk about, he was a believer, but that happened since his childhood. I've read that he had a UFO experience when he was a kid. Not even a UFO. Little green men would come into his room as a kid and steal his toys or something. So he was already living in the imaginal realms, right, Tommy? From a kid, from his parents, everything. He was set up to be a mystic.
Yes, he had some strange experiences when he was very, very young. Some hallucinations, outright visual hallucinations. There's a green reindeer story where he sees a tiny green reindeer at a park. He's about 5 years old. Um, he is, we're not exactly sure what happened, but we are reasonably certain that he was sexually abused when he was 3 years old.
Mm.
And so around the time that he's 4 years old, he starts having these panic moments. And we could call it panic in a very sort of like ancient Greek sense. He has these moments where he senses otherworldly presences which are totally evil that surround him and oppress him, and he's going into these profound anxiety attacks at like 4 years old. I mean, which is very likely related to the abuse that he suffered, I would argue, although he might not like that interpretation.
Right.
Um, and it just keeps getting deeper. The very first thing he ever published was an article in his high school newspaper. He was 15 years old, and it was a review of mind control lessons that he had purchased from a catalog. So, I mean, it just keeps going on and on. Studies witchcraft and Tibetan Buddhism at Harvard, studies anthropology, and all of the great armchair anthropologists from the 19th century, like Fraser and Tyler. He's very interested in those kinds of guys, and Yeats and Blake and all of the great esoteric poets from the Isles. Um, yeah,
Yeah, that's great. Have you had a chance to see the movie Queer? I know I wanted to see it, but My good friend, the Reverend David Perry, who's head of the Valentinian Church in England, brilliant scholar, and he's gay. He told me stay away from it. He hated it, so I haven't been able to see it. What do you think? Have you seen it, Tommy? Would you recommend it?
I have seen it. I think it's interesting. I also think it's a missed opportunity in a lot of ways.
Mm.
It's a beautiful movie visually speaking. I mean, it's very well made. It's shot very well. The sets are great. The costumes are great. It has a good cast. I think Daniel Craig does a good job as Burroughs. One of the problems I think that you would encounter when playing Burroughs is that he had such a unique personality and a unique vocal delivery that there's maybe the temptation to do a Burroughs impression, which is what Kiefer Sutherland does in the movie Beat, and it does not come off well. It's a bad performance. But Daniel Craig doesn't do that. He doesn't do an impression. He just plays Burroughs as Daniel Craig, which I think is very competent. It was fine. Um, they they add some stuff, and it's interesting. So they add an ayahuasca scene to the movie. Are you familiar with this?
No.
They combine some elements from the Jahe Letters, which comes out in '63, which is well after he writes Queer in like 1952 and 52, 53, somewhere around there. And the Jahe Letters are published in '63, but that's all stuff that he's kind of working on mostly after Queer, maybe somewhat concurrently with Queer. And those are based on his journeys in South America looking for ayahuasca. So there's no ayahuasca trip in Queer, the novel, but they add one for this movie. So I think like, okay, that's cool. They don't do a good job with it. The experience, in my opinion, doesn't feel like what ayahuasca feels like. It doesn't have an ayahuasca vibe. They do the schlup, which was this idea that Burroughs wanted to achieve a unity of consciousness with a younger man. So he wanted to do this with Ginsberg. He wanted to do it with Louis Marker, who is this love interest in the movie Queer. It was like a telepathic merger of minds where you and this other person can somehow merge telepathically, and then you become this third entity, which is called the third mind. There's a Geisen Burroughs book called The Third Mind. It comes from this concept. It's also called schlupping in other parts of the Burroughs corpus. They do the schlupp in the ayahuasca scene in Queer, where him and Marker are merging bodies. It looks fine. It's kind of a cool visual effect, but they don't do much with it. And I think that when you have an ayahuasca scene in a film, it's perhaps an opportunity to do something a lot more challenging and a lot more daring, to maybe incorporate some type of cut up editing or some type of dream world
Uh,
experience, or to give me a glimpse of the inner zone, which is something that he saw when he was on an ayahuasca journey. But they don't do any of that. They just do the schluck for a little bit and then they move on. So it's a missed opportunity, in my opinion. The other thing, which I think is also a missed opportunity, is they add an ayahuasca scene. So they're obviously comfortable with adding something, but Queer is an unfinished novel, technically, because Burroughs was supposed to write about his wife's death in the book, but he can't bring himself to do it. So the novel remained unfinished. This
mm,
could have been an opportunity to maybe do that scene, but she's not in the movie either. So they get comfortable adding stuff, but they still don't add her. But I mean that would have been interesting for me to do. They shoot her death scene in this 2000 movie Beat with Kiefer Sutherland and
uh,
Courtney Hart, but it's not good. We still don't have a good version of that event on film. This could have been an opportunity to do it. They don't do it.
I'll check it out then with your recommendation. What can I guess I'll tell him. I won't tell my friend David I saw it. He would be very upset, but I need to watch it. I've watched any movies in, obviously, like you, Naked Lunch, Peter Weller, still my favorite of any movie that's depicted Burroughs. So great film. Well, yeah, we are getting towards the end. Good to see people in the chat. Good to see Graham, Melissa, everybody else. Of course, there will be an audio version. All podcast providers for members, subs on Substack, you will get the podcast plus a full bonus where we summarize Burroughs and some other interesting things. But as we get to the end, Sherilyn, any last comment or question from you?
Well, I look forward to checking out your book. And do you have some forthcoming, or what's in the works for the next step of Burroughs scholarship?
I've got a couple
of the academic conferences.
I just did some conferences in the summertime. I didn't talk about Burroughs in any of them, but I got a couple of Burroughs articles forthcoming. I wrote an article about Burroughs and David Lynch, and I did a kind of a theory article about Burroughs and transgenderism.
Awesome.
So those should be coming out soon. And then I just got to write my dissertation this upcoming year and graduate. So that's my next big focus.
Have fun.
Thank you so much.
You can do
it. Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be great. Awesome. Well, we're at the end. Well, Sherilyn, thanks for keeping us company. Always enjoy your wisdom and insights.
Super fun. It was great to meet you, Tommy. Look forward to staying in touch and reading your stuff.
Yeah, great to meet you. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah, Tommy, really appreciate you coming on. Again, part of the course with Gen X Wasteland and David Bowie and all that. So I'm glad the work you're doing is really adding so much richness to the high weirdness conversation and shedding light on one of the great Gnostic giants of the 20th century. He should be up there with Philip K. Dick and Grant Morrison and Carl Jung and all those cats. So thanks for making it happen, and thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
And for everybody else, yes, have a good rest of the week, and we will talk soon on the next Gen X Wasteland. Take care, everybody.